Consensus Toronto is coming up next month, May 14th to the 16th, 2025. Toronto is the birthplace of Ethereum. And if you believe HBO's Money Electric documentary, it is also the home of the creator of Bitcoin, namely Peter Todd. All this to say, if you disagree, that there is incredible crypto and blockchain innovation happening in Canada. And joining me to discuss is the executive director of the Canadian Web3 Council, Morva Rohani. Morva, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Very exciting time for the crypto ecosystem in Canada.
Lots going on. So, just to kick things off, what are some of the expectations you have coming into Toronto and some of the work that you're doing at the Canadian Web3 Council?
Yeah, of course. I think having consensus come to Toronto is a huge moment for Canada's digital asset space. It signals global recognition of the depth and maturity of our ecosystem. I'm expecting the tone to be pragmatic but optimistic. Canadian builders, policymakers, and regulators, I believe, are all confronting a moment of inflection, whether we will either lead or get left behind when it comes to digital assets. With the US accelerating its regulatory clarity and global players moving quite quickly, I think Toronto will be where Canada starts to publicly reassert its strategy, or at the very least, open the conversations around the topic of where do we fit in this moment of rapid innovation. At the Canadian Web3 Council, so we're a not-for-profit advocacy organization focused on building a more transparent, inclusive, and innovation-driven digital economy in Canada. And we work directly with policymakers and regulators and the industry to push for a clear and thoughtful framework for digital assets in our country. So that means everything from helping establish guardrails around whether it be stable coins or consumer protections, to pushing for the ability to, for instance, hold assets like Bitcoin in tax advantage accounts. So we cover everything when it comes to policy and regulations in Canada. Our work is really about creating a regulatory environment that fosters innovation while at the same time keeping our country globally competitive. And I think that is especially important right now with heightened geopolitical uncertainty, where as a country, we kind of have to reassert our sovereignty as well as our competitiveness.
Let's dive into that because that is a hot topic right now. Rewinding to the beginning of the year, the United States was really leading crypto policy in a very optimistic way, a very huge change from the prior administration. The Trump administration was opening doors to crypto companies. They were inviting them to the table, literally to the White House. And President Trump said that he wanted to make the United States the crypto capital of the world and a Bitcoin superpower. So I wonder how that has impacted Canada as well as the rest of the world in your view.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the U.S. has gone from regulatory ambiguity and regulation by enforcement to full force positioning on crypto. And the recent crypto positive rhetoric obviously only amplifies that. I think for Canada, I mean, combined with newly announced tariffs against Canadian imports, it really pushes countries like ours to think strategically. How do we assert economic sovereignty and maintain relevance in an increasingly digital and decentralized world? I believe that it's time for our policymakers and regulators to really think about crypto beyond it being a fringe issue. I think crypto or digital assets and the technologies are becoming embedded in trade, payments infrastructure, discussions around modernization of our entire financial system. And in Canada, we do have quite a conservative culture when it comes to financial regulation. And so if the US is embracing digital assets to modernize and secure its financial systems, Other countries like ours need to be equally bold, or we risk falling behind. And so in Canada, we're at a tipping point. Either we build a robust, responsible framework, or we end up having to import innovation from elsewhere in the long term.
Speaking of which, I mentioned in the beginning that Toronto is the birthplace of Ethereum, and the Ethereum Foundation is located in Switzerland. I feel like it was an opportunity lost with all these innovations happening in Canada and moving away. What is this? What are your thoughts on that? And where the state of crypto is right now in Canada?
I think that's a perfect example of where there was lost opportunity in Canada. Shortly after that, I believe there were a few incidences of market failures in the crypto sector that were specific to Canada, which, there was a regulatory response to that. And it's been, I believe, like 6 years since that has happened. And so ever since then, regulators have taken a very conservative and overly cautious approach to this sector. And so I think we need to obviously acknowledge areas where we need to enhance consumer protection and ensure that folks are safeguarded against market failures. But at the same time, what happened with the Ethereum Foundation is a perfect example of where um, if we don't balance consumer protection adequately with innovation and unlocking opportunities for building new things, then we risk losing that talent and we risk losing that innovation and exporting it to elsewhere. And now more than ever, we need to think about what makes us competitive as a country. And so I think getting that balance right is more important than ever.
So, what do you think the economic cost to Canada is on losing out on these opportunities?
I think the economic cost, like in specific dollars, is hard to tell because it's still an emerging sector. But at the same time, I think one big opportunity lost for us is uh, the potential for using these advanced technologies and new ways of doing things. We have well-known issues within as with regards to productivity and efficiencies in our economy. And so now more than ever, we need to think about how do we increase productivity? How do we improve efficiency within our economy to make us more competitive as a country? And so
Are there
those
specific examples you can provide in terms of sectors or certain businesses?
I think the top opportunities that I can think about, one would be payment infrastructure. So in Canada, we don't even have real time rail, which is pretty much an advanced payments infrastructure. Our financial system in general, compared to other trade or our other trading partners, has been slower to catch up on innovation. So immediate things I can think about in terms of in terms of benefits to Canada. One would be stablecoin infrastructure, for instance, um, for payments, for trade, cross-border commerce, real-time settlement. There's real opportunity for Canada to lead in this sector with smart regulation. And as you've seen, the U.S. is already leading in this space with recent announcements. Tokenization of real world assets. We're starting to see serious momentum around bringing capital markets onto blockchain rails. And this isn't theoretical anymore. I think that's another big opportunity for Canada that we could be taking advantage of right now by providing regulatory clarity quickly. Um, and thirdly, I think the biggest opportunity that we're missing out on as a country is the fact that more and more Canadians are paying attention to this sector and are voting accordingly based on where they think that the country's going from the perspective of financial innovation and the growth of the digital asset sector. There's a recent report by a Canadian company called ShakePay, talked about how 91% of crypto users plan to vote in the next Canadian election. So it's not just a trend; it's a growing political force that could help shape the agenda for our country, and shape and help voters, like inform how voters vote in for the governments that they want in place.
That's interesting you
And
say,
so
because in the United States, crypto ended up having a great influence and impact on the elections, especially with the super PAC Stand with Crypto. They were able to overturn long held seats in congressional districts. And so in Canada, do you see that happening or having a big influence? And between the candidates of Mark Carney versus Pierre Poilievre, who do you see really standing with crypto in Canada?
Um, so our institutions for like elections work a little differently here. We have strict uh, guardrails around fundraising and campaign financing. So there's no such thing as PACs and super PACs in Canada. Companies and organizations can't directly donate to campaigns. It's a very strict individual contribution of around $1,700. And so I think that we wouldn't see the same momentum, for firstly for that reason, because a lot of Canadians tend to vote based on the issues that directly impact them. But at the same time, we are seeing an emergence of a voting class that this is a top issue for them. They vote with it along with other considerations like housing or affordability or other major issues or healthcare, like other major things that they would typically be voting for. So I would say that is probably something that's a bit of a longer term game in Canada because of the way our electoral system is structured. But at the same time, I think if you had asked me this question maybe 4 months ago or 5 months ago, I would have given a different answer. But today, with tariffs and the threat of a trade war, um, that tends to be top of mind for not just Canadian voters, but also candidates. And so, if you pay attention to Canadian politics right now, and how the different candidates are campaigning, that tends to dominate the discussion. Um, so, uh, but crypto is not alone in that. A lot of industries are not getting a lot of airtime in the election right now. Issues that would typically be discussed in elections aren't being discussed because the number one priority is asserting Canadian sovereignty, uh, getting the best outcome for the Canadian economy and Canadians during a trade war, as well as ensuring that our long term plan paves a competitive
Mhm.
pathway for our economy.
But
So,
between the liberal leadership and the conservative leadership, though, who do you think champions crypto in a more innovative and effective way to really grow and scale the crypto industry in Canada? Would it be Pierre Poilievre or would it be Mark Carney?
I would say we're seeing two different dynamics. On the one hand, Pierre Poilievre has openly championed crypto and Bitcoin as a form of financial freedom and competition against central institutions. On the other hand, Mark Carney brings a more institutional lens, viewing regulated stablecoins and blockchain, for instance, as modern tools to improve retail and wholesale payments. So he does have a track record in demonstrating an understanding, a deep understanding of this space and talking about this space. And connecting it to consumer-driven banking and efficiencies in monetary policy. So I think what's fascinating to me is that these aren't necessarily conflicting worldviews. They reflect the full spectrum of what digital assets can offer. And
Mhm.
so From
Yeah.
my perspective, I think I would be voting for policies. So for clarity, inclusion, competitiveness, our industry's goal isn't to back a specific party, but our goal is to back progress. And so that means engaging with leaders like Carney and Polyev to understand systemic risk and infrastructure, but also great champions like Pierre Polyev uh, who want to challenge the status quo and make room for innovation. So I think what's most promising is that crypto voters are informed, they're motivated, they're policy focused, and that's a signal that any campaign team should be taking very seriously, especially when even within the crypto voting bloc, there's still a significant number of voters who are undecided and looking for leadership.
Finally, just last question. You mentioned the global trade war that is being sparked by US President Donald Trump. How will that ultimately impact the crypto industry in Canada and the rest of the world in your view?
There is risk for the Canadian ecosystem, depending on how the trade war evolves. Um, there's definitely risk of anything that the Trump administration does being associated or perceived negatively, even if it is a positive step for an industry. So from an optics standpoint, there's definitely a risk there. But I think generally we're moving towards an era of principles based, function specific regulation. And this was a trend even before, Donald Trump coming into the office, but it was just slow moving. And what I mean by that is like there's less of a focus on labels like crypto and DeFi and more emphasis on what activities are being performed and what risks they pose. And I have seen that this is a fulsome and productive discussion that's happening in the US that I think could have a lot of positive implications for the regulatory and policy discussions in Canada. Um, I think Canada ultimately is likely to mirror international efforts while still navigating its own regulatory culture. As I mentioned, we have a more conservative and unique regulatory culture. We tend to be more cautious. So I think for regulation to work, it must be paired with vision. So that means creating space for experimentation, supporting competition in the fintech and digital asset space, and keeping Canada relevant as the global economy shifts. Especially with the external pressures that you mentioned. So, but the alternative is stagnation, right? So, I do think while from an optics standpoint, there may be some risk to borrowing or taking inspiration from, the policy approach in the U.S. I do feel confident that the minds and the knowledge behind and the direction of what's happening in the U.S. fully makes sense from a regulatory and policy perspective, because we're moving towards that era of principles-based, function-specific regulation. And I do think that that's a trend that regulators in Canada and policymakers in Canada should be paying attention to regardless, because it's not what's happening in the US is not necessarily out of step with what's already happened within the European Union, or other markets that are booming
Mhm.
within the digital asset space. So I think ultimately we just have to ensure that we're following the trend internationally, but at the same time figuring out a way to be uniquely competitive.
All right. Morva, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Great to have you. That was Canadian Web3 Council Executive Director Morva Rohani. You can catch her live in person at Consensus Toronto, May 14th to the 16th. Be sure to sign up for tickets early before prices go up at consensus.coindesk.com, the most influential event in crypto and the #1 destination for deal flow.